Hi guys, and welcome to the CH Faction tier list. So, for the tiers we have, from top to bottom, Gem, which is for highly influential factions that are just like the best. Then there's Based, which is factions that are based. Then there's Cred, which is factions that are pretty decent, but they're not great, but they're not bad either. Then there's Mid tier, which is for factions that are just mid. For whatever reason, they're not specifically terrible, but they're not good either. Then there's Boring tier, which are factions that are not specifically bad, but they're just boring. Then there's the Trash tier, which is self-explanatory. Then there's the Inio tier, or Inio tier, which is just the worst of the worst. Just completely just like the shittest factions. So, without further delay, let's begin. PRSP, People's Revolutionary Space Program. This faction existed in World War I. In 2018, it fought against the Soviet space program, but after World War I, it kind of ceased to exist. So it's going to go in the Cred tier. Next up, STRU-7, or Strut, whichever you prefer. It was a thing in 2019. It was one of the major factions in the Cold War at the time, and it was actually one of the first factions to have a proper lore section and stuff like that, when most other factions did not. So it's going to go in the Cred tier. CDA. This faction exists right now, but it doesn't do anything interesting, so it's boring. ZSM, the famous 2018 faction, Zvanska Soviet Militia. It got into a few wars, and part of the lore still exists to this day, of course, including the famous ZSM anthem. So for that, it is based. RIS, whatever. This faction was a thing in 2019. It existed for a little bit, got into a few wars, and then died. So overall, I'd say mid. SLF. They exist currently, and I would say they're pretty good. So for that, they're Cred. Cab. Gem. Republic of Severosia. They're pretty decent, but they're kind of inactive, so they're going to go in Cred. CV. Confederation of Venus, I think. They're okay. I put them in boring, but they do stuff from time to time, so we're going to put them in mid. Tuov, made by the same guy who made ZSM. They got into a few wars, made a UN thing, and then died. So they're not as good as ZSM, so we're going to put them in Cred. USP, they don't do anything. Boring. ZY, Germany. What kind of name is that? Trash tier. Umbrian Empire, one of the most historic factions of all time. Definitely a gem. Aquathia. Again, very historic faction. Started in 2019. Has a lot of history. So they're based. PRA. People's Republic of Astroland. Boring. ASP, one of the two oldest factions. They took part in World War I. They actually existed before CH, and they existed for a very long time. But they did slowly die, so it's quite sad. But overall, they're a gem. Jovian Imperium. Pretty much the inventor of the bricks. They got into a few wars, so we're going to put them in cred. Decress, the first one. It was in 2020, and I'd say they're based. UK, trash. It was just a bad faction. NPS, Mercury Planetary State. I would put them in mid, because they didn't really do much interesting. But they did have a interesting faction map, and some good lore, some good world building. So we'll say that cred. KCE, Caldo-Crucidian Empire. I would say that cred, because they were alright at first, and then they just did the same thing over and over again. So they're mid. RSA, Rising Sun of Albrania. What kind of name is that? Mid tier. Ostonskan Empire. Gem. Kingdom of Haranon. This was Gromit's faction. I think it was 2019. And they were pretty good. I'd say they're based. Free City of Moscova. Dog's current faction, as of this video. And they're based. Firsto, trash. RC. I think they were a thing in 2019. Mid. RSF, they're a thing in 2018. Mid. Luna Mosca. I'd say they're based. HMSP, a faction that fought in the First World War, but as with many factions that fought in the First World War, they kind of ceased to exist immediately after it ended. So I'd say they're based. Niristania, or however you pronounce it. I'd say it's pretty good. Cred. NSS. Cred. Atwina, the old one from 2019 or 2020. Based. Ubrialand. Of course, the origin of the name Ubria. And they were a thing in 2019 and 2020. They were quite good. So, overall, based. ARN. Biggest Small Deals faction. Boring. Actually, trash. South Ubrialand. Mid. It's just not that interesting. It was a thing for a bit. At a similar time as regular Ubrialand. It split for a bit. But it's kind of mid. Oceanic Federation. They're pretty good. So we'll say that they're cred. Eternal Order. A thing in 2019. They were involved in a major war. Some pretty interesting events. So overall, cred. APT. A faction. There was a corporation in 2019. They weren't that interesting. They did add to the general atmosphere of the time. So for that, they're cred. KI. They're a faction right now, and they're boring. Inio. An infamous faction for just being shit. They're just shit. Just Inio tier. PRK. People's Republic of Kyrgyzstan. Trash tier. NASA. Boring. First Imperium. This was a faction I made in 2018. It was pretty good. I'd say it's based. USSAR, this was Dog's most notable faction before being Ubria. I'd say they're based. They got into some conflicts, some pretty historic events, so yeah. SSP, Soviet Space Program. The Soviet Space Program is another faction that was in World War One. They're also one of the first two factions alongside ASP. They're one of the biggest factions. It actually had, I think, over 100 members, which is way bigger than CH was itself at the time. But after the First World War, it's kind of just fell apart. But it did kind of start off the entire thing. So for that, it's a gem. GP, one of Gromit's factions in 2019. I'd say it's mid. Actually, it's cred. It did do some things. Underground Empire. Based. ESA, Rocketman's first notable faction. It existed in 2020. It continued existing for a very long time. It got into a lot of different wars. It did a lot of interesting things. Overall, I'd say it's based. AMS. They exist right now. And they're trash. They're just trash. IA. Mid. They were a thing in 2019. But they're just not that interesting. YR. They exist right now. Boring. They don't do anything. IFE. Mid. GCS. Galactic City State. Rocketman's current faction. And they are very inactive. But they do have interesting lore. And they're pretty good. But because of their inactivity, I'm going to put them in mid. This thing, YK from 2019, something like that. They're mid. TDM, Dog's first faction, or first notable faction, prior to USSAR. And I'd say they're cred. Papal States. Gem. STO. I'd say they're alright. But overall, I'd say they're mid. VC. Inio tier. This is one of the worst factions I've ever seen, actually. Like, it's just terrible. MSP. Moon Space Program. Mid. CSA. Boring. Inactive. You know, what more can I say, really? UFLR. I mean, they're kind of inactive and don't really do anything. They're pretty good at the same time. So, I'd say it's mid. Modern day Atwina. I'd say they're cred. Kalechian Space Program. This existed for a short amount of time around the time of the Ostotskan Civil War. They got into a few wars. So I'll put them in cred. ISF. Mid. Tsardom of Severossia. Gem. Very based faction from 2020. Democracy of Ostotska. The other side of the Ostotskan Civil War in 2018. For being a 2018 faction, it was pretty good, I'd say. So I'll say it's cred. And finally, TEF. I don't know what this is. I think it's a thing in 2019. So we're going to say it's boring. And with that, the tier list is complete.